So this second session is called Alternative Forms of Organizing in the Digital World. And as you can imagine now, the highlight or the accent is going to be put on the digital part. Huh? Our attempt now is to move away a bit from the ordinary critique done to platform capitalism. Probably you have heard both audience here and those at home on recent books like Surveillance Capitalism, published by Zuboff, concepts and themes like extractivism through data or data acquisition, acceleration, behavioral engineering, biases, manipulation. All this is part of the cloud of concepts that we, in a way, want to fight against. Now I'm saying that I'm using the mask and there is no need here, so you can breathe a bit better if you want to. So the idea would be to with the assistance of three prominent scholars that I'm going to introduce in a second, to try to highlight and seek and look at avenues or pathways towards an alternative digital system. There are, again, interestingly, a number of recent works on, for instance, themes like platform cooperativism. Those that might remember the book published by Scholz in 2016. Interesting work done by Morozov and Bria on the democratization of urban digital infrastructure. Same, there are plenty of publications, not that many in our field in management studies, though they are popping up, papers on the governance through blockchain infrastructure, peer-to-peer, trustless systems, and so on, even if each of these words should deserve a caveat and a footnote. So, in a way, what we want to go is to look beyond the ordinary ways to understand how to do business and how to organize in the digital world. So we have three interesting, hopefully very interesting for you, scholars and practitioners at the same time. We will start with Dr. Ali Aslan Gümüsay, the head of research group at the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society in Berlin. And he will talk about grand challenges and diverse forms of organizing in the digital world. Then we will continue here. Thanks very much for coming from Copenhagen. It deserves some recognition. We are not used anymore to this type of people coming from abroad to be with us. This is what we have missed this last month with the pandemic. So we have here Mikkel Flyverbom as well, professor with special responsibilities in communication and digital transformation, and co-director of the Digital Transformations platform at Copenhagen Business School. He's the author of the Digital Prism, by the way, an interesting book that might be of your interest as well. And then we will close with the last presentation run by Marina Michelli, who is Michelli, who is the scientific project officer at the European Commission's Joint Research Center, and she will basically share her insights on a project called DigiTranscope, research on data governance conducted in this exploratory research. So each of the speakers will have, I asked them to try to be strict with the times, some 15 minutes to present, and then as we've done before, we will collect the questions and we will basically start the discussion. So Dr. Ali Aslan Gümüsay, thanks for being with us. I guess that you see us, we still don't see you. Now you're coming up here. Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you, David. And it's really a pleasure and an honor to be with you, albeit only digitally. So it's also a shame and a bit sad not to be with you in person. I think, these topics, they often require the coffee breaks for intellectual exchange. The curious moments that spark novelty, I think, happen oftentimes over coffee. And then also, I think, the topic, and I think that's what is behind this conference, is not just a conference for the mind, but also for the heart. So I think we have, and you've invited people who are like-minded, but also like-hearted. And I think this common passion is easier to be conveyed when being there in person. But this is then the second best option, and I'm grateful to be with you. I guess maybe also, this allows me to be not careful to say that I'm looking forward to Germany or Turkey winning the European Championship. I think I would be more hesitant to say something like that whilst being in Spain. But that's a different topic, I think, football, although there are alternative forms of organizing also in football. Let me actually start with an observation. So on Twitter, a colleague asked for leads on any prior literature on how organization and management studies were not adequately addressing current social issues, such as the financial crisis, the pandemic, or the rise of populism. Right? So that was just actually at the beginning of this week, he asked this question. And the response to this request were some classics, including pieces by Barley, Heinings, and Greenwood in ASQ. And there's also some really good discussions in the Journal of Management Studies in their kind of discourse sections and on the future of organization theory. Then there are lots of news sections actually, and just one popped up in Business and Society. So there are things happening there, right? And then there's research on grand challenges, and that's something I mentioned in this. What are these societal grand challenges? They are social, they're of social or ecological and or ecological nature. So they are societal, they are large, they're grand, and they're not resolved. They are challenges, right? Such as the climate, the coming or the current climate emergency, and the current human inequality. And so people mentioned also pieces like the one by Jerry George et al. In AMJ on grand challenges, or Ferraro et al. In Org Studies, so Fabrizio, Joel, and Draw, where they talked about grand challenges. And I think all this really is I think one approach towards this topic, right? To think about the grand challenges perspective. And I bring this up, and I'll be very, I'll mention a couple of things and try to be very concise in these 50 minutes. I think one perspective which helps us to address these topics about alternative, diverse forms of organizing and societal concerns is this grand challenges perspective, because it is not a theory in itself, but it's a perspective which has a theoretical potential. So especially in our field, in our community, it allows us to address certain topics from a theoretical perspective, and also even offering us to give a theoretical contribution. I have so no PowerPoint slides, but links, and someone in the back will share with you links when I say the numbers, so to say. So those of you online have access to these links. So link 1, please. Link 1 is just a reference to an organization theory piece on grand challenges and institutional theory. And just if you're interested in this discourse on grand challenges, I guess there are 2 ways towards it. One is to take a piece like that, which is quite recent, and see who we cite. And another one would be to go to these kind of first pieces from Jerry George or Fabrizio and al. And see who these scholars, who are they referenced by later on. Now, personally, when I read the tweet, I responded that I see a recent wave of scholarship that engages deeply with the intersection of business and society, that wishes to make societal concerns front and center. And I guess, maybe let me be clear, scholars have been addressing societal issues for a long time, right? The social issues in management, the SIM division was one of the first group of divisions at AUM. But I believe that there's a shift in the number of scholars and the amount of scholarship engaging with the business and society interface. And in this regard, I just mentioned before, journals also established new formats. So somehow we think that the current existing way of publishing is not sufficient. It's good, and we need complementary ways to. And one example would be the Business and Society Commentary, I think, which was just launched a couple of weeks ago, or the Journal of Management Studies blog post section, right, which was launched at the beginning of the year. So there are different ways, I think, that we as scholars try to bring in normative questions, reflective questions, and an engagement with society, both in substance and in format, right? So it's not only that what we talk about, but also how we talk about it and with who we talk about it, really to transfer, to engage, to discuss with society these common concerns. And this conference, I believe, speaks to this wave of scholarship. Now, if we look at alternative forms of organizing in the digital world, what do we see? I mean, I think we see new ways to organize due to one, and this is, I think, what we've seen a bit or a lot in the first session on social movements. We see new organizational practices, right? And from my own work, I mean, I've seen things popping up like a feminist co-working space, right? So feminist values, self-defined by the field, trying to shape a co-working space, or violence-free organizing, right? Oftentimes these things are linked to the future of work, right? And wondering and asking and questioning, how should we actually organize? How should practices be different? And then there is the second part to it, right? So we have alternative forms of organizing, and then the digital world. We have new digital tools that are not tools in themselves, but they obviously, and there's a nice piece by Werner Glaser actually in Org Theory about algorithms and how it's socially constructed. But we see blockchain, platforms, AI, so new technologies kind of emerging, and these technologies obviously also shape the way we organize, right? Blockchains maybe through the growing list of records, reducing uncertainty. Platforms as distance bridging technological infrastructures and matchmakers and multi-sided markets, offering new ways to do business, right? New business models. Or AI, artificial intelligence, so intelligence demonstrated by machines, really allowing new ways to automate things, to organize, to lead, and so on. And just another example, I mean, we've just received a conditional accept for a piece in 2 weeks ago, where we look at the digital social movement, so linked to the first session, and how Xiaohin, so how this organization, and if anyone wishes to read it, I'm happy to share it if you drop me an email. So how this organization uses technologies, or is, I mean, not just using it, but how it engages with technology to further its own movement, right? And just a brief kind of snippet from that piece. They first used TitanPad, and then they were hijacked by right-wing people. So right-wings tried to hijack the TitanPad debate, and they were quite successful because of the affordances of TitanPad. And then they moved to Twitter, and again, right-wing people tried to hijack the hashtag Xiaohin, right? So to kind of show daily racism. But there, the interesting thing is the way Twitter works was, on the one hand, they tweeted with the hashtag Xiaohin, but they tweeted racist slur or ambiguous kind of tweets. But what's interesting is, while on TitanPad they were totally destructive, the technological affordances of Twitter actually meant that while they might have kind of shaped the content a bit and what this means, in terms of the number of tweets, actually the racist tweets added towards the number of tweets for Xiaohin, and it became a trending topic in Germany. Not maybe necessarily because of these racist tweets, but the interesting thing is, I think, conceptually, that the way the platform Twitter works is that any tweet you do with that hashtag adds to the number of tweets, and actually your hashtag might become trending topic because people who dislike it support it. Right? So all these things that really, I mean, can be summed up that we need to look at these alternative, novel, diverse forms of organizing, and we also need to reflect on how we want to call them, right? So we call them alternative here. I use the word diverse. I mean, alternative, Gibson, Graham, and others find that alternative might not be the right word because it's performatively putting you at the side. At the same time, it obviously might show some kind of performativity towards that you are an alternative to off the center. Novelty is another challenge, and here maybe the second link, please. In RSO, we've published a piece where we thought about the novelties, so new forms of organizing, and again, it's a tricky word, and there's obviously debates whether something is new. We examined a digital social incubator, right? And that digital social incubator, and maybe so the way we define novelty is really emic. So we said if something is novel in a field, kind of understood as novel by the field, people behave as if it is novel. And that incubator faced certain problems. For instance, it wanted to meet digitally annually, and it wasn't legally allowed to do so. And that shows that way of organizing was perceived novel. There were no rules to make this possible. So this digital social incubator was or is hybrid in both substance and mode of organizing. Its mission was to integrate domains of religion, commerce, and community. And its mode of organizing really straddled the digital analog divide. Neither incubates, so we call it incubate in the paper, incubates members, nor its external stakeholders could rely on existing institutional templates to make sense of it. So it was not only organizationally new, but also institutionally novel. And as a consequence, it experienced what we distinguish as descriptive and evaluative challenges. It was both not understood, and not accepted. So in contrast to the liability of newness, a very well-known concept, right? The liability of newness, we say that new ventures might also face a liability of novelty. And figuring out new forms, new forms of organizing, face these dual challenges of explaining and justifying new templates to external audiences, while also internal constituents are still figuring out how the logics they represent interrelate. So it's really a novel form which has added kind of complexity vis-a-vis the liability of newness. Now, all this is really to say, and just to give you a couple of glimpses, is to say that we really need more work on new, alternative, diverse forms of organizing due to, one, the organizational distinctiveness, and two, their digital distinctiveness. Now, then the question obviously as scholars is how to find them. And one approach we've heard from Simone is real utopias. So Eric Olin Wright's piece, or Heterotopias by Foucault. And I believe it is useful to study examples of alternative, diverse forms of organizing, real utopias really on the periphery of the mainstream, which demonstrate on a small scale what could be possible. Right? And one comment was whether they just want to stay in the periphery. I think that's also really important, but there's a potential for them to become mainstream. And that is something worth observing, especially if we think about the normativity of scholarship, like, right? By examining something empirically, we might choose normatively that case, but we can still be quite descriptive in our scholarly endeavors. So such works on heterotopia and real utopias allows us to access empirical data while also generating novel insights and implications that can be translated into the center of society. In other words, focusing on the periphery allows scholars to contribute changing the mainstream. So we as academics then co-create social change by theorizing and legitimizing its occurrences at the fringe. Now, there is, however, also an answer that lies beyond such kind of search for empirical alternatives through acts of disciplined imagination. And this is maybe the third link is a piece in Journal of Management Studies, which Simone kindly also mentioned, published with Johanne Reinecke. So in it, we kind of say that it's not about anticipating or predicting a probable future. Instead, we need to reclaim our societal relevance by redefining our purpose in engaging with the future and articulate desirable futures and how they might become reality. But then obviously, how can this be done while maintaining scholarly rigor is a key question. And this really requires us to go beyond studying social reality as it exists and how it came to be towards generating new visions of desirable futures along with productive insights to form and transform it, right? And what does it mean, for instance, for rigor? We call this speculative rigor that we need. What does it mean for organizations? If you think about real utopias, they are, I mean, as Simone mentioned, they have a prefigurative kind of potential. We think imagination, imagining these before, has actually a prefigurative potential. So research can and should have both a preparatory and a performative potential to equip us for and lead towards these desired future or desired futures. So in addition to studying real utopias, alternative forms of digital organizing and so on, there also exist there is also a potential to study organizations that do not yet exist or have not yet scaled, right? I mean, an organization that has not yet scaled, again, is you can imagine it to scale and think about this. And effectively, what we try to say here is we need to go from prefactual, or we need to go from prefactual, or actually from postfactual to prefactual, right? So kind of switching the Trumpian situation to actually creating prefactual situations. How to go about it? I mean, I mentioned that we can examine these real utopias, we can examine imaginative facts, we can imagine acts of deliberation. I mean, another example in the piece we say is if you think about Martin Luther King's dream, this has been analyzed a lot, obviously, by scholars. But I mean, what if, I mean, that's a question we could ask, what if the dream becomes reality? What does that mean for organization theory, right? For theorizing organizing, for theorizing practices? What if certain things become reality? So that's one. Another way forward is to examine moments of crisis, which kind of can serve as critical junctures, and look at what happens there. And here, if you could share links 4, 5, and 6. And again, just to give you some thoughts here. I mean, in our work, we looked at digital organizations in Afghanistan, for instance. That's the fourth link, where crisis is the kind of the exogenous shock creating digital organizing, right? I mean, if you can't go outside, you try to organize yourself inside, maybe through digital means. The second one the other example was, we looked at what Corona does actually to organizing. And obviously, because of Corona, we create physical distancing, right? We have physical distancing like now. What does that mean? Actually, digital tools were used to kind of organize ourselves, right? And in the piece in the Journal of Business Venture Insights, we look at how the response to physical distancing was digital coordination and digital services and so on. And another example, which is a piece which is right now in a review, we look at Israel-Palestine and how, while borders may be closed physically, the IT sector still works across borders through digital technologies. So again, a crisis, a conflict, maybe a war happening at a place, and how then digital means actually impact the way organizations structure themselves. So all these have implications on what and how to study. And then as a last note, and then I'll come to an end, is I think we not only need to think about researching new, alternative, diverse forms of organizing, but also obviously kind of think about what this means for us as an academic community. And I think this has popped up in the first session. And we need to think, for instance, so are there certain expertise, are there certain team structures we need to rethink, right? And here, if you could share the seventh link, so the last link, European Management Review. And then, I mean, if you haven't shared any other links, just feel free to share them. Because I'm coming to a close now. And in that, John Amos and I will look at how actually scholarly teams need to mirror the social complexity to better understand them, right? And if you think about digital technologies, then how do we actually get the right scholars into our PhD programs, for instance, so that they mirror the social complexity? How can we work actually with practitioners in this field? So how do we obtain the contextual expertise needed for digital societal kind of concerns, but also for these new alternative forms of organizing, including language, including cultural understandings? I think our scholarly sphere is still quite homogeneous, and that's something we need to work on as well. So to come to a close, to conclude, is one, I think in terms of the research agenda, we need to examine further these new forms of organizing that are shaped by digital as well as organizational trends and novel practices, right? So researching alternative, diverse, new forms of organizing in the digital realm. This also includes the imagination of empirical data that does not yet exist, right, but may exist in the future. And maybe just as a bracket, I mean, why can't we theorize the Corona crisis before it happens so that we are well prepared when it happens from a theoretical perspective? Second, I think we need to rethink our what this means then for a conceptual focus, right? I think a lot of us care about impact. We care about meta questions, right? About large-scale concerns, and we want to rethink theorizing. And I think the grand challenges is one perspective allowing us to engage with normative questions in a maybe non-normative way, right? And offer some theoretical insights. And then lastly, I think we need to reflect our own practices, our community practices, and also the way we exchange. And I think this conference, and that's why it's just such a shame that we can't be in person. I think it are these platforms that we need, and we see more of them. We see RRBM, we see the organizations, Scholars for Future, mirroring the Fridays for Futures, and so on. So we see new ways of organizing ourselves actually popping up. And I think we need more of these things to not to substitute or replace existing scholarship, but really to enrich and complement that and offer other ways and other kind of career progressions to work in academia that also allow to have impact in manifold ways. And with that, I say, I guess, thank you, and yield the floor back to Barcelona. And the floor seems, or the chair seems to be empty.
There is an empty seat here. Okay, thanks a lot, Ali, for helping us to think about how to theorize the changes brought about by the digital world. Now we move on to the interplay between organizing, governance, and politics with Mikkel. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here. I have had many plans in the last year and many invitations, and they've all led to cancellation. So just being here is a victory in its own, I think. So thank you so much for joining us both here and online and so on. And what I'm interested in is really the question about how digital transformations have consequences for the way we organize, how organizations operate, but also this interest in questions about governance or the kind of politics that come out of those types of developments. So obviously that's a huge question, but what I want to do with the talk is really to sort of offer one way of approaching these questions through a focus on questions about transparency, questions about visibilities, and so on and so forth. So what I'll be drawing on is both the book that David was so kind to mention, called the Digital Prism, but also some work that I'm doing right now, forthcoming work that looks at the sort of politics of visibility. So I'll focus a little bit on questions about organizing and a little bit on questions about governance. So to just sort of situate this talk a little bit, I'll just say a few words about how I think about digital transformations. So I think the starting point is really that there was a point in time where it made sense to talk about digital technologies as a kind of cyberspace, a separate independent domain that we would enter and leave again. And increasingly, as you all know, these technologies are becoming a kind of backbone, a kind of infrastructure to so many parts of society. So we need to think differently about the role of digital technology. And obviously, this is both about sort of realizing that they give us access to information, they can help us distribute information, but also this development that we term datafication, that many parts of social life take a data form. So those are the kind of issues, or the kind of the background to what I'm talking about. More specifically, I'm interested in then the kinds of governance and organization that come out of these processes of digitalization and datafication. So one way to think about this is that we live in a different kind of society than before. We live in a society where visibility is a kind of default. We used to have to hunt for information, spend money and time on digging information out, searching for information, and so on. And that default has shifted into a kind of state of affairs where everything is more or less available all the time, and we need to have other kind of skills, hide things, take things out of sight, and so on and so forth. So those kind of changes that come with digital transformations is where I sort of situate my work. So what led me to do this work was really a sort of both an interest in transparency, but also a kind of, being puzzled about this phenomenon. Because in many ways, with digital transformation, we also have this sort of hope, at least, or this ideal about more information being available, more bad things not being able to hide, and so on and so forth. So this whole idea that with digital transformations, we would get much more transparency, we would, solve many of the problems that we had in the past, and so on. So one quote that captures this, obviously, is this idea of sunlight as a kind of disinfectant, and electric light as a kind of policeman that will help us solve societal problems because we can see more things, no one can hide, and so on and so forth. And under this kind of way of thinking about transparency, I think there's a kind of formula that says, if we just get more information, if we disclose more information, we will see things as they really are, and we can understand the world around us much better, and so on and so forth. And out of that will come more trust, better control, better kind of human conduct as a result. So that kind of formula, what I call a transparency formula, is what I seek to problematize in the book and also in this talk. To say, I think there's something else at stake, something more complex at work than simply this kind of formula that focuses on, the quality of information, the quantity of information, and has this idea that transparency is simply a matter of sort of opening up the window on reality, and then we see things as they really are, and so forth. So that kind of equation between, getting more information and solving societal problems is the starting point for this kind of thinking also. So instead of talking about transparency as this window we open on reality, in the book and in my work, I talk about the management of disabilities. So when we get digital transformations and processes of datafication, we also sort of propel processes of people, individuals, and organizations having to manage visibilities in many, many different ways. So, and this is why the book is called the Digital Prism. So instead of a metaphor that talks about windows, I talk about digital technologies as these prisms that refract realities and create new kind of phenomena and so on and so forth. So I'm interested in these developments that come with digital transformations that are about how we sort of see things in new ways, show things in particular ways, manage information, and also hide things in new ways, and so on and so forth. So that's what I mean. I think of this as a kind of starting point or analytic that offers one way to think about how digital technologies affect organizing and create new forms of governance and so on and so forth. So in some of my empirical work, I've then looked at different kind of organizational settings where questions about transparency seem to be at play and where digital technologies made things visible in new ways and so on and so forth. So obviously we can think about workplaces that are monitored and where different forms of surveillance take place. We can think about glass offices, the whole sort of spectacle around open offices and so on and so forth. Some of this work, empirical work I did for the book, was at Google and Facebook in Silicon Valley, where we have these kind of weekly meetings where everyone can ask questions to their bosses, and there's a sort of culture of openness and transparency that they really sort of pushed for, at least for a while. And also these questions about what happens to us as individuals when we start to think of ourselves not just as a sort of human piece of, a body of flesh and so on, but also a kind of digital twin or a digital double, as a kind of collection of digital traces that we also have to manage and navigate and make sure that if future employers or the public sector starts to make decisions about us based on those digital doubles, we have to nurture them and we have to manage what goes into them and so on and so forth. And then also, looking at, this is a picture from the German Pirate Party, one organization that really took this idea of transparency as a kind of starting point for its political ambitions and aspirations. There's a wonderful paper by Leopold Ringel in Organization Studies that looks at this. What happened, they had this idea, we want to make everything we do transparent to voters, to the world outside. So every meeting would be live streamed, everything would be available online and so on and so forth. And what happened obviously was that no other party wanted to collaborate with them, because you can't do politics if there are no private spaces where you negotiate and find a common ground and so on and so forth. So it just speaks to this point that these aspirations towards transparency create a particular kind of dynamic, and this is what I call the management of visibilities. All these decisions, all this work that goes into deciding what to share, what to hide, what to keep to yourself, and so on and so forth. But taking those types of ideas from the level of the organization into questions about governance is what I'll be focusing on right now. So what happens when processes of datafication enter this sphere where we do politics, where we try to sort of develop new forms of governance and so on and so forth. So some of my work has been to sort of articulate a vocabulary that captures the kind of processes that go into this kind of politics, that draws on data and tries to sort of shape the world through algorithms and other kinds of digital tools and so on and so forth. So questions about how we come to see phenomena through this digital prism, how we produce knowledge through these types of means, big data, algorithmic sorting, whatever, and also the kind of governance that then emerges from these types of efforts. So in the chapter I'm finishing right now for a book by Andrea Bregenti talks about these coded visions, that out of these approaches or these ways of doing politics, we see some particular logics that are both technological but also political in a different manner. So 2 examples that I look at in the chapter, one is to look at the way we use data for purposes of prediction, such as in policing and other areas, security and so on, where there's a sort of tendency to take models developed for something like earthquakes and import them into police work and try and sort of treat crime as if it was an earthquake. So these kind of logics that travel with digital technologies and data-driven systems is really interesting, I think. Another empirical site that we look at is a tool that was developed to sort of prevent radicalization. And it works simply by picking up what people do online, and then if somebody is profiled as a possible, soon-to-be terrorist or radicalized person, that system will start feeding people other kinds of information to sort of give them a broader view of ISIS, give them a broader view of what it means to be a terrorist, and so on and so forth. So these types of approaches that really, and this particular system uses AdWords as a kind of starting point for thinking about how to treat people's activities online, and so on and so forth. So these kind of travels of logics from one domain to another is what I'm interested in. So I'm interested in the kind of visions or the kind of politics in a broad sense that come out of these phenomena. So to wrap up, I think of these as a particular kind of politics, a politics of visibility that draws on datafication and enacts particular forms of politics, and obviously do so by reproducing some ideas about the sort of objective and other kinds of features of these types of approaches that draw on data and algorithms and so on, but also create something new, create something that we haven't seen before, so to speak. So I'm interested in how different social phenomena enter what I term this digital prism, become sort of datafied and refracted and reorganized through these types of systems. And obviously also to think more broadly about the kind of political interventions and forms of politics and governance that come out of these ways of treating the social world. So I think this is valuable because it offers us a kind of a vocabulary for thinking about these phenomena that have to do with digital transformations, organizations, and politics. And drawing on Bregenti again, I think visibility offers a kind of one lens to think about these issues. So this means we can think of the management of visibilities both as a kind of fundamental social phenomenon, but also a kind of analytical vocabulary that can help us understand some of these broad changes that I'm interested in. So I think I'll stop here, and I look forward to questions about, what does this mean also for social movements, or why don't we have social movements that engage in these types of issues, and so on and so forth. So thank you.
Okay, now we can go to the third panelist. We will collect the questions afterwards, and then I already have a few here in the chat. So those at home who feel like posing questions, don't refrain yourself, and you have the time, and keep on adding comments if you want to. So our third panelist is Marina Michelli. She will work on her, she will tell us and share with us the results of her project, DigiTransCope. So thank you, Marina, as well, for being with us.
Good afternoon, and thank you really for the kind invitation to this great workshop. I am coming a bit from a different background, so I'm not coming from management study, but I really hope that my talk could bring a contribution to the debate. So you should be able to see my slide. Okay, so as it was anticipated, I will present work on data governance conducted within the exploratory research project called DigiTranscope, which run at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. Sorry, of course. So the Joint Research Center, for those who do not know, is the science and knowledge service of the European Commission that is in charge of providing scientific evidence to support European policy. And the project investigated the emerging approaches for personal data sharing, control, and use put forward by different social actors beyond big tech. And it identified 4 alternative data governance models. I say alternative, but I could also say diverse, because the idea was that this model had to differ from the take it or leave it approach for handling personal data that is typical of big tech platforms. And they do so granting more decision-making power to a broader range of actors. So this work was moved by 2 main goals. Develop an heuristic tool to examine data practices through a social science-informed perspective that I will explain in a bit, and contribute informing European data policy, promoting for a fairer data economy, so addressing this data asymmetry. So the work starts from the premises that a wide variety of imbalances exist when it comes to accessing data, but also in the ability to derive meaningful information and insights from it. So this has been called the big data divide, for instance. In particular, it's being said that data subjects have lost control of their personal data. So they generate massive amount of digital footprint, but this information is mostly and mainly used by data holders company to further generate profit. And so the potential of such data to create social value remains mostly untapped. So these relate to the debate on secondary use of data, such as the use of data collected by commercial companies for the public good. So like, for instance, the use of GPS location data for crisis response or urban planning and so on. So basically, in this context, we asked, to what extent current data asymmetry are tackled by these different or alternative models of data governance that are more inclusive and that produce different kinds of value. To do so, we proposed a social science informed definition of data governance. So such definition emphasizes the power relation between the actors that are involved in the way that data is handled or that are affected by it. So it also emphasizes the kind of value that is produced and how such value is redistributed among the actors. And also it accounts for the socio-technical arrangements that sustain certain approaches. And these socio-technical arrangements include the underlying principle and also system of thoughts that are at the heart of this model. So basically, we understand data governance not as data management, not as data protection or regulation, but mainly as the decision made over data, who is able to make such decision over data and to influence the way data is accessed and benefited from. So we see data governance as the result of a process that develops also from the practices of the various actors, from the interaction, cooperation, negotiation between the various stakeholders for controlling data. So the models that I'm going to describe in a bit that are emerging from such practices of such social actors are of course embedded in certain economic and regulatory settings, but at the same time, they might shape future regulation and future digital economy. So the definition draws from science and technology studies and critical data studies, and in particular from 2 concepts that allow to investigate the power dimension within complex socio-technical arrangements. So one is that of data infrastructure, so the idea that each data governance model is a socio-technical ecosystem with a plurality of actors with multiple agendas interacting with an array of tools, mechanisms, values, and systems. And the other one is that of data politics, which is the notion of the new power relations that are generated in the process for accessing, controlling, and using data, especially also looking at that towards data subjects. So in 2018 and early 19, we did a review of relevant documents from both the scientific and the gray literature that imagined or described alternative practices for data governance. And we identify 4 emerging models. But such models that we describe in the paper are ideal types. So basically, they are abstract conceptualization that emphasize certain traits in order to synthesize the phenomenon that in reality differ for the degree of affiliation to those traits. So they do not claim to offer the exhaustive and final pictures of all possible models out there, but they wish to provide a basis to understand how the emerging models are redressing power asymmetries between big data platforms and other actors. So I will now give a high-level overview of these models before moving to the conclusion and the main takeaway from this study. So data sharing pools are, what we define data sharing pools are horizontal joint initiative among 2 or more data holder organizations that could be both private and public that establish partnerships for sharing, aggregate, and analyze each other data. In that case, the goal is the distribution of the economic benefits among all the partners involved. But even if data sharing pools are the most widespread among the models that we have found, they have important limitations that have to be highlighted. First of all, data holders that possess more valuable data sets might have, of course, greater power to set the terms for how data is accessed and used, and might use data sharing pool to actually conserve a monopolistic position. On the other hand, data subjects do not have a say in this model because they are described mainly as recipients of the innovation that are developed, the data-driven innovation that emerge from such data sharing pools. And one of the main underlying principle of such a model is that the idea that data is a market commodity. So data is exchanged with the main goal of filling knowledge gaps and creating more profit for data holders. Basically, the idea that more data means more value. So it's not very different from the idea that is based on platform capitalism that we know. On the other hand, we have data cooperatives, which have been a bit mentioned before, which are grassroots-driven, decentralized organizations in which members of a certain community a community that could be online or on a certain location, voluntarily pool their data together, and this data can be used following the rules that members have approved. So data cooperatives wish to foster democratic control over data and an equitable share of the benefits that are produced. So they are aimed at generating benefits from the members of certain community. For instance, if we think at health data cooperatives, but at the same time, they foster public interest and social change, for instance, health research or workers' rights. So there is, of course, high interest at the moment on this model, but we have to say that they are mostly niche initiatives with limited uptake. For instance, because they rely only on data altruism, but they do not have public sustain or incentives. So it's very difficult for this to scale up because of the low uptake, and also in terms of keeping democratic engagement for all members. The underlying principle stems from the cooperative tradition of the cooperative movement, but also from the recent platforms cooperativism. So the cooperative movement promotes fair condition of value production in a non-monopolistic and democratic setting. So what does it mean? That data co-op explicitly aim to provide an alternative to the extractivist model of platform capitalism. The third model that we call public data trust is when a public actor, usually such as a local administration, establish a relationship of trust with citizens and manages data on their behalf. So a public actor assumes the role of a trustee and guarantee that citizen data is handled ethically and securely while enabling the reuse of data for the public interest. The main limitation or challenges of this model is that at the time it is mostly a conceptual model, and there are very few projects that are putting this in place in total as it's described in these ideal types. And it requires indeed putting in place trust-building governance mechanisms such as citizen consultation or independent data stewardship, and also the data awareness among citizens and among public bodies is limited, as well as data culture for putting in place such models. The underlying principle of public data trust is that data with a public interest component, such as data that is collected as a byproduct of utilities consumption or while moving on public transportation, is part of a public infrastructure. And so the information it affords should produce value for citizen and society. As the work from Morals of Embria that was quoted in the introduction is very seminal in this regard. And then the last model that we described is that of what we call personal data sovereignty, which is a model in which data subject individually regain control of their personal data through ad hoc digital services. So a key mechanism for this model is the existence of an ecosystem of personal data spaces that are intermediary digital services that citizens can choose for storing their personal data or aggregating data that is disseminated on different platforms, and also control data sharing with third parties and exchange data for research. So personal data sovereignty empower individual citizens by improving their ability to make choice about their data, and at the same time foster economic growth through new commercial digital services. And the main limitation of this model that we found is that the personal data spaces, which are in the end business entities, might have interest in, and in a way might be interested in nudging user so to reach a bigger position in the market and take advantage of a network effect. And also, on the other hand, the majority of citizens at the current time would not have the skills nor the interest to take advantage of the opportunity offered by such services. And a key underlying principle is that of technological sovereignty intended as reducing the influence of big tech and states in the control of technology, but in this case applied to the level of the individual user. So from our analysis, we have identified and described 4 emerging models, which in a different way foster more inclusive forms of data governance that differ from the dominant one of big tech platforms. But thanks to the social science informed understanding of data governance, the typology that we found brings to the surface key difference among the models beyond apparent similarities. And first of all, 3 out of 4 models involve data subjects, which is of course an important step for a more democratic data regime, but is not certainly enough and have very different implications. In fact, although the 3 other models are all based on the idea of having a trusted data intermediary that gives more power to data subjects, they have very different dynamics, because such trusted data intermediary could be a cooperative that allows to keep democratic control over data and produce benefit for community and society, a public body which is entrusted by citizens to use their data ethically and for the public interest, or a commercial service that is chosen from an ecosystem of similar services that compete on the market. So we would say that the same notion, or maybe buzzword, is sometimes used to refer to data practices that are associated to very different models. So these underline how important it is to think critically about data governance as socio-technical system with certain power relations. Moving to the conclusion, we think that various social actors are indeed conceptualizing or developing new approaches for data governance that redress the asymmetry of power of the dominant model. But most of these are in their early stages or niche initiatives or pilot projects, as we have said. There is no one-size-fits-all data governance models to be recommended or promoted for an equitable data landscape, but probably a combination of these models should be promoted. However, the results shows that the involvement, of course, of civil society and public bodies as key actors is important for promoting models that are truly alternative in terms of power relation and value production. So their role in data governance should be supported to avoid that market forces determine who have a say on how data is used and accessed. So finally, a social science perspective of data governance is useful in our view to uncover the power relation and detect differences in emerging alternative or simply emerging governance models. So ultimately, we hope that the typology presented in the paper could be an heuristic device for scholars and policymakers to design empirical research or develop theoretical commentaries that address the issues of data power and that sustain the development or of more desirable future for our data economy. So thank you. Thank you for listening.
The speakers. Okay, we have some 25 minutes for questions. I have a couple of comments in the chat, but perhaps here in the auditorium, someone wants to intervene or raise a comment. If I may, I will start with trying to make a link between the first and the second session. There was an author that appeared in the two sessions, which is right on the utopian, real utopias. It was addressed as well by Marina in her last presentation, but and she identified one of the crucial problems that I think everyone working on the digital sphere realizes, the problem of power asymmetries, let me put it like this. So if we want to highlight the possibilities for alternative forms of organizing, what is, in all this spectrum of possibilities, forms of organizing, where do you see a specific light of hope? For instance, in the case of Marina, probably you will highlight that some of these, in this model that you have shared with us, you see a ray of hope in this direction or in another one. In your presentation, Mikkel, perhaps you gave more a critical tone about appropriation of data, potential for surveillance, tracking, profiling. This is open for the three of you. Where do you see the rays of hope for organizing differently and confronting this power imbalance? Yeah, Ali, please.
Yes, happy to go first. I mean, I guess where's the hope? I mean, I guess technology obviously has its affordances, its implications, but at the end, obviously, the power dynamics depend on all of us. And so I guess my hope, let me give you two reasons of hope. Is one is I think that there are more and more people who care, obtain expertise. That's one thing, right? And I mean, you see new programs popping up on technology, on AI and ethics, on AI and responsibility, AI and society. So there's more and more capacity building, which gives me hope. And the other one is, I think, a caring, right? I mean, a deep caring for these topics. So, I mean, technology is not neutral in itself, but if there are people who care, and I think scholars who care, I think that gives me also hope that we can use the transformative potential to its advantage and not disadvantage.
I see some hope, certainly. I think some of the ways in which we are sort of starting to lift the fog or the veil that surrounded digital transformations and digital technologies for so long, that they were forces of democracy, they were forces of expression, they were the kind of solutions to our problems. And that veil has sort of been lifted in the sense that we are realizing that our data is being harvested not for purposes of solving our societal problems, but for selling ads. So that, those basic kind of realizations, I think, are important. And it's not just about some companies, big tech companies, it's really about a business model that is starting to surface as something that we can regulate and we can talk about and maybe down the road get rid of. So I think that creates some kind of hope. I think also, as the last presentation was about, new ways of thinking about data as a resource, not for selling ads, but for, bringing people together, solving problems, and so on and so forth. And I'm curious to know if there are sort of even bigger initiatives that could be done in this area, institutional developments that would help us make data work and serve these purposes. And also, I think even bigger public infrastructures that would sort of take some of the insights that we have now gained about problematic business models and ways of working with data and put those into infrastructures that would have some degree of data governance possibilities, some degree of privacy by design, and so on and so forth. So I think, there are all these little developments in so many different contexts, from the European Commission to national governments to small cooperatives, so many people starting to say, we want digital technologies. No society has developed without technology, but we want to talk about the terms and conditions that technology comes with.
Thank you. I don't know if Marina, you want to say something?
Yes, well, I agree with what has been said, and as I think you understand from my presentation, I think that, I hear echo, okay. Well, the involvement of public bodies and communities and civil society at the same time, it's probably the key strategy for actually enabling these new forms of data governance. And as it was said before, yes, some mistakes have been understood, but I think there is still much to learn concerning technological solutionism and the problem behind this. And so this was also one attempt from our work. But again, also in this case, I think there is very much more awareness, both in scholarship and it's beginning also among policymakers for sure, especially in Europe, and also at the civic level. And I think also the debate that concerned, for instance, the release of contact tracing apps was very interesting, especially in Europe. It was interesting to see the movement of privacy activists and other kind of activists to problematize the solutionism thinking that there was behind the idea of developing such app and the risk that were associated to it. So, and I think this kind of debate, public debate, informed also some recommendations that were then released by the European Commission. So there is, in that case, there is definitely hope, but there is a lot to do still, I think.
I think at least the first one by Elke Schusler, I think it was related to your presentation, Ali, on what did you mean by data that has not yet happened, and how to use historical counterfactuals to develop future scenarios? I don't know if I fully understand it, but how to think forecasting. Once you talk about these attempts, how to theorize the change brought about by technology. Yeah, going deeper into this counterfactual and forecasting.
I'm happy to respond to that, and I think it's maybe the most contentious part, or scholar from my presentation, and also from Viviane in my paper. Let me maybe give you 3 brief examples of what this means. If you think about Corona, there are many scholars, including myself, who have published articles about Corona after it had happened, right? And what we need is, though, oh, this is my son coming in. We organize in different ways, families who come together here. 3 families in one home. So Corona, before Corona, how could you do research ex ante, right? And you couldn't because it didn't exist, because you didn't have empirical data. And this would mean that we could imagine these things before they happen. That's one example. Another example would be AI singularity, right? Could we not think about AI singularity before it happens and theorize that? Independent of whether this will become true or not, but then we have our theories ready if it happens, right? And a third example, I mentioned the Martin Luther King speech. Another example would be, how about a gender equal or a racist-free society or organizing? Now, if it doesn't exist, what if we imagine a racist-free organizing, for instance, to exist and theorize what that means before it exists? And this is what it would mean. It would be to theorize what does not yet exist, to develop theories that equip us if it happens, so Corona, or it gives us a foresight towards what we would want to do, and then kind of shadow backwards to get there.
Okay, thank you, Ali. We have a couple of questions, 3 questions, not 4. Well, that's fantastic. We've gone from 0 to 4. So we start with Maya, please.
Thank you all. Very interesting presentations, very timely and relevant topic. As an educator in this space, I teach students in business analytics, and I teach them about data governance, and we talk about the problems that lie in this field that you've pointed out. And in addressing these, I wanted to hear your take on what's the balance, what do you think about different approaches and their feasibility? And I think about the approach of targeting the suppliers, right? The big tech, the suppliers of the data governance that as we know it. There's been talk about regulation, breaking them up, et cetera, but also about the education of the demand side, right? The users. And we know from research that people get hooked on false news because they elicit surprise and anger and tickle curiosity and speak in a way to very human tendencies that don't necessarily bring out the best in the media landscape as we've seen it. And so I was wondering, how could we foster these alternative models of data governance that you, Marina, talked about, or how should we address the supply and the demand side, and what would be sort of promising ways forward that would sort of lighten up these rays of hope that David has already mentioned? Thank you.
Thank you. I think this is a general question for any of you. Anyone who wants to give it a shot? Not an easy one. So I think we can approach the same question with the other supply and demand. So how should we educate the citizens as well? Perhaps, I mean, not that much focusing on big tech, but can we do something as scholars and educators regarding the citizen and how the individual should react against these threats, challenges that we have identified?
Well, of course, as I said, for most of these models to be successful is indeed a key that citizens are able to use this tool for data governance and have a reason to do so, and the skills, the time. So there is much work to do in terms of data culture and data awareness. It can be for sure done through education, but also at the level of public institution, because when we mention the idea of public data trust, of this kind of innovative data-driven service at the level of, for instance, local level or the city level, we have also to imagine how different cities face this, and the fact that not all cities and local administration have the same economic and human resources to engage, and as well as data literacy and data culture. So basically what I want to say is that, of course, the inequality that are in society are very much reflected in the way that all these models can be successful. So in a way, the point of studying data power and also inequality in relation to data access and ability to use data is very much important to also somehow minimize the hype that is sometimes beyond such models, which have to be, I think, promoted as in the spirit of this conference, to think of alternatives, but at the same time, it's important to ground these alternatives in the limitation and societal limits that they face. I don't know if that's clear, but I think these are two levels that have to be stressed by scholars in this field. Yes.
One starting point for dealing with some of these issues is really that we back up a little bit and look at the digital domain as in the same manner as we look at other kind of industries. So a kind of normalization of both the way we regulate these companies and also among customers and consumers or users, a kind of normalization that, yes, of course you can contact a company, even if it's not a company that sells you something, but you have some kind of a relationship with through your data. So there are all these kind of strange solutions in the digital domain that we don't accept in other contexts, like signing up for a bank and never being able to take your money out of that bank again, for instance. I mean, signing up for Facebook and never being able to take your data out again. Those types of strange solutions are something that we need to address and normalize, I think. Or other strange things like that you cannot write from one social media platform to the other. We would not accept this for mobile phones, that you could only call people with an iPhone through an iPhone, or only call the people who had the same service as you on your phone, and so on and so forth. So there are all these strange things that can be addressed at the level of regulation through interoperability, data portability, all these types of regulatory tools that are not about breaking up companies necessarily, but simply installing some sort of normal expectations about how they operate and so forth.
Okay, I think I have 4 questions. I don't know if this is feasible. I will ask you, to one after the other. I will try to collect the 4 questions, but if you can do it, we will start with you, Liliana, if you want, very brief. If you can address it to a person, then it's even better. Then Obaid, Marco. Oh.
I think it's her. Oh, sorry.
Okay, thank you. I have a comment and a question, but I will be very brief. So my comment is that maybe we can think about different schemes like around data, and data as a common good, like at Citra Fund, they are kind of testing in Finland, and they are kind of pushing forward a fair data economy based on something that Mikkel was mentioning, which is more data. It doesn't necessarily mean better social provision, and that's one of the comment. And my question is more about methods as a researcher, because I have the feeling that we have in a paradox. We're living a paradox. Like apparently we live in a transparent world, but as a social scientist, maybe we are not equipped with the tools to understand what's going on. So I would like to hear, particularly Ali was mentioning this, and Mikkel to some extent, how are you facing this in terms of research methods and so on? Because many things are at stake in terms of social processes, and maybe we don't have the tools developed enough in order to understand what's going on. Thank you.
We'll go for Ali then. If it's
for
okay.
Ali and Mikkel.
Mikkel,
well, Ali then.
Obaid now, please, very succinct there.
Thank you very much. So my question is actually to Mikkel and Marina. Just given some of the insights that you had, I believe what's becoming more visible is our own activities. Meanwhile, some of the digital platforms are operating more in the dark, right? Given the kind of mechanisms we've talked about, is the individual capable of managing their own data? The amount of, for example, the concept of light. We only have 2 eyes, so if you shine too much light, we wouldn't be able to see anything. And it seems like that's what's happening with the information, right? It's available, but it's not really accessible. We're not able to process it. So if is the individual capable, or are they going to get overburdened? And if not, then what are the alternative mechanisms we need to see? And if it's government, then how do we address the cozy relationship between the platforms and the governments themselves in terms of accessing data?
This one will go for Marina, then I understand? Okay, Ali, sorry, the 4, we will try to do it under 5 minutes, I think.
Thank you very much. This is mostly for Professor Mikkel. You mentioned how digital transparency allows us to see things as they are and allows us to tackle some of the societal problems. But aside from the not so novel paradox of like when radicals are censored, they go underground, we are seeing net neutrality being compromised through governmental regulation, being able to get social media platforms to suppress the opposition in the name of radicalization. So what are your thoughts on this? When you've seen this with many right-wing governments, such as the Modi government in India and Netanyahu's government in Israel?
This is for Mikkel then.
Yeah.
Okay, and the last one for Marco.
For Marina, thank you for your presentation. And you used in different moments in your presentation the notion of value, no? Value generation, value distribution, which is a critical point. I'm going to talk about open source in the last section. And so I know how difficult it is to measure, identify the generation and the distribution of value in the digital environments. And in the data, is happening something very similar to what we observed in the open source. No? That, for example, most of the transactions are not mediated by monetary transactions. That is the basic way we use to measure value. And another typical aspect of the data that is also common to the open source is that most of the value is generated through the sharing. Now, more we share, more value is generated. You know? And it is completely different, even opposite to the typical forms of realizing value through the markets. No? So these are very challenging issues that we have to address. And I wonder if you have thought about this, or if you have seen something which is interesting about how to address these issues.
Okay, so now you basically have 1 minute, each of you, to try to, well, give your thoughts on the questions that were here. Can we start with you, Ali, since you were...
Yeah, sure. And let me just say it's wonderful that we have 1,500 scholars, 3 kids, and 1 cat present. I can see a cat on Marina's screen, so that's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, 1 minute, 3 questions, because there are also 2 questions in the chat. So the question from the podium or from the audience was on the technological skills and then the necessity to require these skills or acquire them. I mean, in the EMR piece, we talk about contextual expertise and that we need, as a scholarly community, to develop these skills, right? That means that not each of us individually has these skills, but as a community, we need to think who to recruit, how to work in research teams, and how to build institutions. So at the Humboldt Institute, for instance, we have IT experts, lawyers, we have social scientists coming together on these topics, because digitalization is really a topic which crosses all these disciplines. And I think we need to build new institutions. One side note, we once taught a program in Oxford on entrepreneurial leadership in universities, and there's a university in the USA where they are spatially organized around problems rather than departments. 2 sentences to the questions in the chat by Elke. So it's not forecasting or scenario planning, because these really focus on probable futures. What we care about is desirable futures that might actually be not probable or not likely, but that we could develop to make them more likely. And then the question by Andreas about the AMR piece by Purana et al. That is a really good piece. I mean, one could argue philosophically whether that's a tautological argument and whether it's actually impossible to have anything novel in the world if one follows their argument, right, about what is novel. I mean, the way we do it in the piece with Michael Smets in RSO, we call novelty something which is amic, not attic. So it doesn't matter whether it is, in their argument would be there's nothing novel in principle or a priori. We would say there is something novel if it's perceived as novel. And I think that's different, but from a social science perspective, I think perceived novelty has an impact on how organizations and people enact that novelty. So I guess it's a complementary argument to the one by Purana et al. And I hope this was 1 minute.
Thank you, Ali. Marina, now you want to...
So thank you. Regarding the question on the individual, as I said before, I think individuals at the moment are not really capable of adopting these, let's say, digital services for the management of data. And most of all, I think the solution should not be on the individual level. So that's why the presentation focused on this idea of trusted data intermediaries, and also to look critically at these trusted data intermediaries to better understand what are their goals and what kind of relation they establish at the end when they are implemented. And I think that public bodies will definitely have a role, but that there is increasing discussion on how to make them more trustworthy. And so the establishment of citizen consultation, living labs, or independent data stewardships, so that is not the public body itself, but it goes through a non-profit organization. So there are a series of mechanisms that public bodies have to put in place to act as an intermediary for enabling these data governance models. And the other question about value, thank you, and I was expecting some question on this regard from this conference. And what I can say is that, of course, thanks a lot for your specification. And the point of this paper was not really to measure value, but to have a normative understanding of value. So to look at what other kinds of value besides economic value are looked for in these models. So so probably that's a different angle, but I'm happy to discuss more if you get in touch. Thank you.
We are over time, but 1 minute for you.
Right, thank you. So thank you for your questions. I think I'll address the one that speaks about how to solve some of these problems surrounding data and so on. And I think it's interesting to see that these, in the end, are not really technological questions. They are really questions about individual competencies, responsibilities, and then they're, I think, institutional questions. So on one hand, I don't think it's a good idea that individuals should be in charge of handling their own data. I don't think we should sort of individualize the responsibility for these things. But on the other hand, we've seen something like the iOS update that asked users, do you want this app to track you or not? 95% in the US said no, thank you. Just so phrasing questions in such a simple manner is one way, I think, to activate a kind of personal responsibility. But for the rest, I think a lot of it has to be institutional. It has to be, different kinds of societal institutions that take on this challenge and try and address that problem. So I think that's a minute.
Okay, so thanks a lot. We went over time 1 minute, but
well done.
Yep. Thanks again for being with us. Okay, so my 2 cents on our panel. First panelist was Aslan Gümüsay on how to combine grand challenges and institutional theory, how to theorize about the digital transformation applied to the business and society field. And here he recommended us to look at the subject, specific players in this interplay, social movements, practices, even values behind this transformation, looking at the novelty. So he was making an invitation to think what is specific about this transformation that is taking place. And he was inviting us to theorize this change through the new appearing forms of organizing, all to contribute to this author that pop up several times right on the idea of alternatives and real utopias. Our friend Mikkel Flyverbom, he provided one of these instances about how to theorize the consequences or on the impacts of digital change. And for instance, he made a nice move from transparency, which is one of the ordinary keywords in the digital sphere, to start discussing about the managing of visibility. And here he made a few reflections on datafication, social ordering, profiling, surveillance, as an invitation to explore how we are transforming the way to deal with this visibility, not that much transparency. Finally, Marina Michelli contributed with a very interesting, I would say, framework, typology of alternative ways to capture data handling practices, from data sharing pools to data cooperatives to public data trust to personal data sovereignty. And the interesting element here was this reflection about the pros and cons, the limitations and potentials behind of each of these different models.